Plywood versus steel. In 1944, Germany massively builds training and false tanks. The former nullify the risk in PNK training. The latter lead bombs into the void. The tree buys the army time and lives. It sounds impressive. In February 1944, Germany urgently demanded the production of wooden tanks. The formula cuts the ear, promises a sensation, and conveniently lays out the chaos of war in a calendar cell. But the reality of the front and headquarters is more stubborn than the headlines. There was no magic telegram that could turn steel into plywood with a single stroke. There was another, much more interesting story. By the beginning of 1944, the army was exhausted in people, fuel, and time, and the infantry had to learn how to kill tanks at throwing distances. This required safe, cheap, and massive full-length targets, and convincing baits for other people's bombers. That's why the fields of Europe are covered with plywood and straw. Not instead of tanks, but for the sake of people, and for the sake of days, which the army lacked. Then where did February come from? Journalists like firm dates. The historical process prefers chains. In the German bureaucracy of 1944, everything was decided not by a single order, but by a series of manuals, memos, and Merkblattes that adjusted infantry training and defense organization. The troops overloaded Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, built up melee platoons, and relearned how to approach an armored target under smoke, across courtyards, and through gaps. Any mistake in such games was worth the blood. So first we build layouts, work out the angles and tempo on them. Then we allow the beginner closer to the caterpillar. Administratively, it looked like a constant paper noise. Pay attention, hold classes, equip landfills. The dot on the calendar sheet is convenient for memes, but it doesn't describe the funnel of solutions well, where February dissolves into January and March. It is important to understand the difference between the types of wooden tanks. The first are life, size educational mock-ups, a frame made of timber and slats, plywood silhouette shields, sometimes a cloth skirt, sometimes a cart or a sled frame so that the target can move. They were made on divisional training grounds and in company parks on a case-by-case basis. A chalk sketch, a hacksaw, clamps, a T-34 or a Sherman was ready in an evening. The second was fake machines to deceive the eyes and cameras. Awnings, fake exhaust fumes, tracks, scattered shell casings, oil crates, and an accidentally thrown piece of tarpaulin were added there. From the air, such shops sometimes looked more convincing than the real ones. Perfect cleanliness does not happen where people and cars live, and skillful imitation of household negligence did wonders. Why did 1944 become the time of plywood? Firstly, because the proportion of urban and dilapidated landscapes is growing. In such a setting, the tank is not the king of the field, but a heavy beast trapped in bullet-riddled streets. The infantry has to work with him on the breath, understand the dead zones of the view, the habits of the mechanic, the inertia of the tower. This is taught not by posters, but by full-length mock-ups, where you can literally touch the armor with your forehead and catch the correct height of the Panzerfaust shot. Secondly, because saving resources has become a religion. Every hour and liter of fuel is spent on airlifts and real combat. Driving a training column for the young fighters to practice jumping to the stern is a senseless luxury. Plywood replaces the motor where you need to fill 1,000 sets in a week and survive 1,000 mistakes without a funeral. Thirdly, because the fight against the enemy's eyes in the sky has become a daily routine. Allied aerial reconnaissance became faster, more accurate, and angrier. Without false parks and thinning targets, bombs found too much real iron. The myth is also fueled by the visual side. The archives are full of pictures of soldiers smiling at a plywood T-34 on a sled, where a company grove of thin silhouettes of towers stands in a vacant lot, where inflatable Panthers are stretched out in a row. Photos are published out of context. It seems as if fantasy replaced industry. In fact, the cadres record the learning process, not the outcome of the replacement. A banal but saving technique is appropriate here. Who took the picture? Where? When? And to which document it was attached? If there is a record of visits to the landfill and the consumption of smoke bombs nearby, this is an educational story. If there is a map of airstrikes and a report on the successful absorption of the raid, this is a disguise. Mixing them is convenient for clickbait, but historically wrong. The content of plywood is reflected in tactics. On the training model, they teach not heroism, but repetition. You see the target, cover, short jerk, pause, angle estimation, shot, position change. The adult boredom of craft versus the romance of one punch. The layout allows you to miss the distance with impunity, lean out too early, get tangled in your belt, and realize that a fence, boulder, and truck body provide different elevators for the line of sight. After a dozen attempts, muscle memory appears. On the 51st, panic gives way to routine. These are saved lives, but without the usual statistics. Masking layouts work differently. The main thing here is not similarity from 3 steps, but verisimilitude from 3 kilometers and from 3 seconds of viewing on the tape. A convincing shadow, reasonable dirt around, footprints from the entrance. A signal, life was here recently. Plywood helps to create the structure of the frame, and further details bring the deception to perfection. When a scout is in doubt, the blow dissipates, and when he is sure, it sometimes hits the void. This is not a miracle or a hoax, but a statistic. The more false parks there are, the lower the density of attacks on the real ones. In the arithmetic of the 1944 resource, this economy was immediately felt. Hence the honest formula instead of the myth. Not, Germany switched to wooden tanks in February 1944, but, during 1944, plywood models became the norm for training and camouflage, because there were almost no other cheap ways to quickly teach infantry and simultaneously defuse enemy attacks. February remains a convenient headline, but the meaning of the war is not in dates, but in the routine of decisions. Plywood in the fields was not a symbol of poverty, but a tool of professionalism. Complex skills were broken down into safe exercises, and the risk to living people was shifted to a dead tree. Next, we will talk about practice. How exactly such models were built, what exercises were practiced on them, what mistakes were burned at the training ground, and how the training plywood differed from the phantoms designed for the scout's lens. There is less pathos, but more benefit. And benefit and save time in 1944 were worth more than any beautiful dates. The training model is not a toy, but a safety net for those who tomorrow will meet a real car weighing under 30 tons. In 1944, the grid was stretched everywhere. A life-size silhouette of the target was assembled from a raw board and rusty bolts. A timber frame, plywood turret and side shields, a cutout of the stern with a hint of radiators, sometimes imitation rollers and tracks, so that the eye clings to the usual pattern. Toboggan runners or wheels were attached to the model. 2 ropes, and the tank already knows how to climb around the corner or roll back. The main advantage of such a tree is that it tolerates endless mistakes. An infantryman can choose the wrong angle 10 times, break the pace, miss and stay alive, and the instructor can calmly sort out every mistake and make them repeat it to automatism. The learning tasks were divided into simple but stubborn elements. First, the dry approach without weapons. Cover, jerk, pause, glance, next jerk. The instructor hits the helmet with a stick, setting a rhythm. Not to run, but to work in cadence. Then the tank layout was added. It was placed so that the student could feel the dead zones of the view. The nose was a wedge. The tower turned away the sector. The aft niche was open. This is the corner where the chance of survival is higher and the armor is weaker. Next is distance learning of a specific weapon. For Panzerfaust, the height of the front sight and the actual arc of flight are important. At 30 paces, the aiming point is 1. At 60, it is already another. The plywood contour allows you to retrain the eye without risk and count the steps. With the body. With Panzerschreck, we trained not only taking out the lead, but also the discipline of a safe jet. No one should stand 3 meters behind the shooter, otherwise burns are guaranteed. On the marching posters, a dry line says this: plywood and sand provide an experience that the muscles will not forget. The cleverly made layout lived for a long time. It was sewn with thin steel patches in the affected areas. Hit. The chalk turns white on the sheet. The judges record the result. If it didn't hit, the trajectory pattern remains. You can see why it was thrown up, where the shooter hurried or moved the body. A pair of canvas covers made it possible to turn a conditional T-34 into a Sherman or a Panther in 10 minutes. Because the set of vulnerabilities and the height of the aiming points varies. Sometimes bags of straw and cans of water were hung from the frame. This was how they imitated the insides and large recoil when touching, and at the same time reduced ricochets when firing blanks with propellant charges. The methodology was built around repeatability. No romance, just the boredom of the craft. Approach the target 50 times along one route, then change the terrain. A parapet, a fence, a battered cart, a low stone curb. Shoot 50 times from different positions, from the knee, from around the corner, with a short hold of breath. In the cold and in the heat, in boots on slippery clay. Each approach was evaluated according to a checklist. Time, accuracy, sector compliance, departure to the second number, or a change of position. On a dozen approaches, the student shoots back like a god. On 100, real habits manifest themselves. The layout allows you to reach this 100 without writing off equipment and without risking people. The most dangerous mistakes were worked out in advance until they cost their lives. Shooting head-on by inertia, when the target was big and scary, was treated with a simple trick. A fictional zone of senseless bravery was marked with a red stripe on the plywood. If you cross over, you'll get a fine, even if you hit it. Incorrect height estimation is a classic for Panzerfaust. At close range, the grenade goes just below the imaginable line. The instructor made him draw a trajectory on the board with chalk and pronounce the takeaway until the brain stopped seeing the straight line. Violation of discipline after a shot. Stand and admire the hit. Bounced with a shout and a stopwatch. Shot. 2 steps. Turn. Cover. The tree also helped that the apparent success did not cloud my head. No burning oil, no screeching caterpillars, so there was less temptation to celebrate. Psychology is half the battle. Plywood does not remove the fear of the mass and noise of a real tank, but it extinguishes the initial stupor. The soldier stops seeing the myth in the armored car and begins to see geometry. The car turns into a set of planes and angles that can be won. On this foundation, flavors of reality were added. They were allowed to touch the hot caterpillar of a decommissioned chassis, and a real car was idled nearby to learn the sound of a U-turn and the inertia of the tower. But without 100 plywood approaches, these spices did not give much. A strong emotion quickly wore off if the body did not know the route. The economics of plywood are also straightforward. One real tank as a dancing partner is fuel, engine life, crew, and the eternal risk of an emergency breakdown. You can't do a routine of hundreds of repetitions on it. The model was made by the sapper department in the evening, repaired with a hammer and knife, transported on a handcart. He allowed a platoon to be taught at once. While 2 were working with the tank, the rest were running routes and sorting out mistakes at the shield. For company commanders, it was a skill factory. In a week, they worked out what would have taken a month without a tree, and would have consumed all the hours. Good schools added tactile specifics. The contours of the nodes were drawn in thick chalk on the armor. The hatch of the mechanical drive, the cannon mask, the stern sheet, the MTO cover. Each branch number knew its own sector and its own sequence of actions. The duty backpack contained ropes for a fast cart, a tarpaulin, 2 cans of tar to simulate spots, and a set of wedges to expose the silhouette with the right angle. They even learned to set smoke not abstractly, but in conjunction with the geometry of the target. To block the gunner's view with a curtain, but not their own escape route. Plywood didn't interfere with subtlety. It disciplined it. There are also honest limits to the method. The layout does not crush the body, does not break the wall, does not roar the gearbox. He does not teach you to hear a gas failure or a crunch when changing gears. Signals by which experienced fighters guess the moment of the jerk. It does not give a feeling of true dangerous proximity when the heat of the engine is felt by the skin. Therefore, the best courses ended with a mixed day. A real car passed next to the plywood. The fighters stood in the shelter and noted how the shadow shifted, how the dust blew, how the smoke screen blew out. But it was the plywood that brought people to this day, who had not bravado, but technique. If you put it all together without romance, the picture is simple. The training model is a machine that sharpens the instincts of melee infantry. It's cheap, rough in appearance, and priceless in effect. He transfers risk from blood to wood, from 1 try to 100 approaches, from the myth of heroism to the craft of survival. In 1944, it was precisely this kind of accounting that paid dividends. Every minute not spent correcting a fatal mistake in urban combat saved not only the shooter's life, but also ammunition, the medical instructor's time, and the evacuation. Calculation. That's why there was plywood in the fields and yards so often. Its purpose is not to portray strength, but to multiply skill. Next, it is logical to look at the second half of the Wooden War. at the phantoms and false parks, which forced the enemy to waste blows into the void, and thereby bought some more time for the living. The plywood war consisted half of lessons at the training ground, and half of performances for the audience in the sky. If the training layout saved the beginner from his own mistake, then the Phantom Park tried to turn the opponent into a mistake. Aerial reconnaissance saw war in the form of spots, shadows, and footprints. Its task was to build up real power and intent from this abstraction. The task of the maskers is to plant a plausible lie. In 1944-1945, this game became a daily occurrence because the speed and accuracy of aerial photography increased, but the resource of troops, on the contrary, did not. Wood, tarpaulin, and rubber turned out to be materials not only for craft, but also for deception. What is a false park in practice? It's not a row of perfect cardboard boxes on a field. It's a scene thoroughly littered with household details. The silhouettes of the cars were placed at natural intervals, at an angle to the road, as if they had just been overtaken. The sides of the tanks were made of plywood. The towers were made of a frame with a tarpaulin. The rollers were hinted at by the pattern, not the mass. It was not the close correctness that was more important, but the long-range impression. Shadows should fall as the time of day dictates. There were traces of entrances and U-turns on the ground. Boxes with spare parts, pieces of awning, empty, fuel crates between cars. For volume, coils of rope were thrown onto the roofs, and fake barrels and a field workshop with a workbench were placed next to it. The scale of the deception was based not on a beautiful layout, but on the chaos around it. The aerial photographer was not a romantic artist. He was looking for patterns, the correct intervals, the rhythm of the shadows, the consistency of the roads, a place to bring ammunition. Therefore, the trick was to synchronize. At dawn, the shadows are long. The layouts are set so that the shadow from the tower is thicker and from the trunk is thinner, emphasizing the convincing silhouette. During the day, they played by other means. They lit the smoke of the repair zone, scattered dark spots of oil, stretched awnings from the sun, under which life. Even the trash mattered. Clean venues betrayed a recent production, and a light patterned mess created history. From the air, the brain trusts history, not geometry. The night episodes looked different. Lighting engineering groups imitated the muted lights of cars under awnings, the warm spots of stoves, and traffic lights for short distillation. Sometimes they put up a sound screen. A telephone wire with suspended tin cans and small motors was pulled through the forest plantations, creating a background rumble. This is not magic or cinema, but a struggle for the operator's attention. Several reliable channels at once, vision, logic, hearing, increased the chance that the real blow would go into a phantom. Inflatable divisions were a separate line. The rubber armor is good for speed. The crew deployed the battalion in a matter of hours, pulled the compressor hoses from the truck, and exposed silhouettes on the edge of the forest. Such layouts are easier to turn face to the camera. They live at the pace of an offensive or distracting operation. Their weakness is shadows and excessive cleanliness. 2. Make the picture heavier. A roll was made on the ground, planks were thrown, and 3 or 4 steel objects were placed, creating hard glare. In the rain, branches were placed under the flooring so that the contour would not fall through, and a smooth puddle without traces would not give out. A strong phantom was almost always a complex. Cars without people are inconclusive, and people without logistics are even more so. The false park was accompanied by accompanying decorations. A radio post hut, imitation antennas, a kitchen cart, a row of empty boxes at the edge, chopped melons from old tires, similar to the remnants of repair work. Sometimes one real truck was placed next to it, so that the camera would get a reference. Hard, silhouette, and believe, the neighboring soft shadows. The high, stakes option is to spread out. Instead of one dense park, there are several small points in logical locations. Intelligence sees a lot of little things and concludes that many companies are present, although there is a plywood ensemble and a couple of living units on the ground. Resistance to the lens included counter-reconnaissance. The maskers studied the habits of the pilots, from what altitude the flights go, at what hours the tape is active, which markers most often become decisive. It turned out that hard lines and perfect symmetry are especially dangerous. They don't happen on real venues. This means that the symmetry must be broken. One silhouette should be slightly expanded, The other should be broken by the roller. The third should be given the wrong angle of the barrel, as if the mechanic had been tinkering and had not finished. Thus, a plausible negligence was built. In 1944, victory often became a derivative of the skill of pretending to be unattainably ordinary. It is worth speaking honestly about the boundaries of the method. An experienced photogrammetrician read not only the subject, but also the context of the landscape. A plowed field preserves the memory of a track. A forest belt preserves the height of cars, and snow preserves warmth. If there are no traces of parking spots around the Phantom, if the shadows behave according to the textbook, if the roads are empty and the bushes are untouched, the mask quickly falls through. Moreover, radio discipline and movement schedules were given away by dead parks. When radio silence was broken, the fakes ceased to be convincing. Therefore, competent disguise has always been combined with a communication mode, false negotiations, and the accompaniment of noise. Mathematics is also worth mentioning. The mask doesn't have to trick every camera. Her task is to stretch the density of the blows. If the enemy distributes bombs to 3 or 4 points, of which one is real, live vehicles get a chance to survive the raid. In artillery training, this looked even clearer. False targets pulled out batteries for extra sighting, and each sighting was a 1-minute respite for the column in another area. That's exactly the economic point of Phantoms. Cheap staging bites off expensive minutes from expensive weapons. The false columns on the march worked in a similar way. Light frames were loaded onto trailers. Tarpaulins with a hint of a tower and a trunk were thrown over them. And corner reflectors were sometimes placed on the roof to increase radar visibility. The road filled with silhouettes. Dust followed the entire caravan, and the observer got a rich picture of the movement. The real technology was running in parallel, in empty clearings or under the shadow of the woods. In the snow, they used stamps for the track. Sappers dragged a transverse frame with a cutout caterpillar pattern and guided it at the right steps so that the weight of the column and its rhythm looked plausible. The Allies and Germans exchanged tricks without sentimentality. Inflatable Shermans and plywood T-34s, fake guns and fake tanks were included in the general catalog of the war. This is not a small trick, but an industry of plausibility. Its product is the doubt of the observer. Where the scout is in doubt, the command loses its sharpness, hits wider, checks longer, and later moves on to the next target. On the operational schedule, this can be seen as a restored hour for the real units, to have time to leave, change the area, and survive until dark. Phantoms don't win one-on-one battles, but they change the probabilities. They add a decent amount of artificial uncertainty to the survivability of the troops, turn the enemy's strike force into expendable material for the void, and create temporary islands on which to regroup. In conjunction with the training plywood, this closes the circle. Some models teach people how to survive next to armor. Others make bombs and shells die away from this armor. This is how the invisible infrastructure of the saved minutes was assembled from wood, cloth, and smoke. And a minute pulled out of the jaws of war was like a factory, only without a roof and pipes.